Ooh, all right. Welcome back to BeekTalk. This is the second episode. Today we're going to be talking about winter feeding. So BeekTalk is a show for beekeepers and people who are interested in learning about honeybees. And like I said, today we're talking about winter feeding, which is a topic that's up for discussion. Many beekeepers have different approaches to how they keep their bees. I do a more traditional or like organic style of beekeeping. Some people are opposed to winter feeding. Some people run their operations strictly considering winter feeding. So what I like to do with this show is have a discussion. So if you keep bees or you know someone who keeps bees, you can certainly comment in the comment section and talk about your experience. If you feed, how you feed, what you feed, those kinds of things I love to have in the comments. If you're from, like I'm here in Pennsylvania, but if you're from around the world or from somewhere else in the country, just let me know where you're from so we can have a full in-depth discussion about this topic. So I'm just going to pop up a few things and wait for a few more people to hop on the live stream, and we can get started. Like I said, there's a lot of different approaches to how people run their apiaries. I feed all my hives going into winter. I feed my hives throughout the year as well. This area of Pennsylvania has like an ebbs and flow of when resources are available. So I actually feed my bees during the spring, a little bit in the middle of the summer as well. And I also feed them in the fall and of course over the winter as well. So it seems counterintuitive to be feeding your bees so much, but really it's just knowing when to feed them and what to feed them. Yes. So like I said, if you have any questions about bees or if you have experience with feeding your bees over the winter, definitely drop them in the comments. I have a friend from Shahola, which is also in Pennsylvania, in the discussion here. So what is up with winter feeding and why do beekeepers feed during the winter? The whole food economy of the hive revolves around honey. Honey is the main food source that bees use to get their energy. Beekeepers, of course, like to harvest some of that honey. So we extract honey at a time when there's surplus in the hive, and we're going to feed the bees when we're anticipating a drought or a dearth of resources. So we feed during the winter to make up for honey that was harvested. We also will feed to allow early brood rearing. The bees will naturally lay eggs and grow and shrink the size of the hive to match the resources that are available. The beekeepers like to get things going a little earlier, so we'll feed in the winter and in the spring to artificially induce the bees to lay more eggs. So that's a method that some beekeepers don't follow, and like I said, it completely depends on your approach to how you keep bees. What are we going to talk about next? Oh, the last reason why beekeepers will feed during the winter is insurance. There's some discussion in like the natural or organic methods or approaches of beekeeping where they say, listen, if the hive doesn't survive winter, it wasn't a good enough hive to keep the genetics of. And I understand that. That's a really good method for selectively breeding and splitting hives in your apiary. You know, certainly, just like any other living being, the weak will die, the strong will survive. My thought towards it is sometimes all the hive needs is a few extra pounds of food to finish winter. I've seen hives that live all winter long, and then just 3 weeks before dandelions bloom, which is the first good resource of food in the springtime, that hive can die. And it's really unfortunate that you're nursing these bees all summer long. You put them into winter, and you're really excited to see them in the spring, and they just die just a few weeks before the season kicks back off again. So I live in the school of thought where I would rather my bees survive winter and then just change the queen in the springtime than to let the whole colony collapse. But like I said, there's different methods of beekeeping. So if you're a person who is strictly opposed to feeding bees, I'd love to hear some of your reasonings. So definitely drop them in the comments. So I talked about why beekeepers feed. Now let's talk about what they feed. Like I said, honey is the main source of food for bees during the, during their entire life cycle. But we can't make honey. Only the bees can do that. So what we feed is dry sugar. You can buy this anywhere. You've used it before. You know where to get it. Other things that you can use is fondant. If you don't know what fondant or fondant is, it's usually used in bakeries. If you ever go and you go to a wedding and the cake is covered with like a Play-Doh-y kind of paste, that's fondant. And basically it is sugar paste. It's like a Play-Doh made out of sugar. So it has a lot of carbs for the bees to consume. Like I said, it's a mushy paste. Sometimes it's a little thicker, and you can cut like sheets of it to lay on top of the frames of the hive. Other times it is like rather runny, and you'll have to like take a scoop and put it on top of the frames. So we'll get more into fondant in a little bit later in the discussion. Other things that you can do is make or purchase, they're called candy boards. And basically what it is it's dry sugar that is moistened to make kind of like a brick. So if you have a bag of sugar in your cabinet and you've had it there for like a year, you realize it gets clumpy. What the sugar is doing is actually soaking up the moisture from the air and becoming that clump. That's basically what a candy board is. Excuse me. And then lastly, like I said, you can feed honey. So there's a few different ways to do that I'll dig into a little bit later in this Beek Talk. If you're a beekeeper, you might notice that a normal candidate for feeding bees was not on that list. I did not include syrup on the list of winter feeds, and there's a few reasons why. In the winter, it requires too much energy from the bees to convert syrup into usable energy. They can do it, but they have to heat up the syrup to a working temperature to be able to process and metabolize it, and that takes a lot of energy. So, it's hard. It's counterintuitive to have the bees use a lot of energy to get some energy from the food they're trying to feed them so they have enough energy. The other thing that syrup does is it adds moisture to the hive, and moisture mitigation is something that we try and reduce in the wintertime. So feeding thick or heavy syrup through the fall is good. You kind of have to stop doing that when the daytime temperatures drop below 60 or so degrees. That's when it really starts getting too cold for the bees to process syrup. Moving right along, feeding pollen. Sugar and honey are carbohydrates. Pollen is protein. So just like you and I need some sugar and bread and, you know, that kind of stuff to get energy, we also need protein to get nice and strong. Same thing with the bees. We feed the bees supplemental pollen. Some beekeepers do at least. That is to make sure that there's extra bees or fat bees, like really healthy bees, going into winter. Feeding pollen in the fall is a great idea. Feeding pollen in the early spring is also a great idea. I would ask you to take some caution when feeding pollen during the winter. Adding supplemental pollen in the winter artificially induces the bees to lay eggs earlier than usual. The presence of pollen is actually a biological trigger for the bees to lay eggs. And usually pollen's only available when nature is ready to start producing pollen and ready for the bees to start flying. Beekeepers can time this and add pollen when we think the hives are ready. Otherwise, if you're not sure about like the ebbs and flows of the pollen in your area, I would not feed pollen during the winter. I would just wait and feed it in the spring. We'll do some more pollen later. Another thing that I want to talk about is how beekeepers feed their bees. Now, talking about feeders is a whole other discussion, and I'm going to go in a lot more depth on a separate Beak Talk about that. I have some people in the chat. Hello. But feeders is a whole separate discussion. I'm going to quickly talk about a few things right now, but I'd really like to talk about some other methods of winter feeding. The first feeder that I want to talk about is a rapid round. It looks like this. It has a little hole at the bottom. Whoop, 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 whoop. It has a lid that I can take off, and it has this inner chamber. And what beekeepers will do is they'll take their lid for the hive, drill a hole in it, and then just put the feeder right on top. This is a great method for feeding syrup. Not that great for much else. What some beekeepers will do is take out this inner crystal and fill this cavity with dry sugar and allow the bees to come up out of the hole and consume the sugar. But in my opinion, I want to mention, if you use these rapid rounds for winter feeding, for dry feeding, I would really love to hear your feedback in the comments. My personal opinion is that the rapid rounds keep the food too far away from the bees during the winter. The goal is to have the food where the bees are. It's cold and they can't go too far without it being warm. So I think a rapid round is much better for liquid feeding, and I think it should sit in the bee shed for the winter. Whoop. One moment, I keep my props in this box. Woo. Another thing, another feeder is they call it a Vivaldi board, or there's a million names for this. It's basically a shim and an upper chamber. So what you can do is put some newspaper in this upper chamber and fill it with dry sugar like this. Just pour it right in. And the bees can eat through the paper and consume the sugar when they need it. This is great because the food is local and the sugar also absorbs moisture. You can also use this to make candy boards. So you'd make your mixture and you'd put it in here, and you just put a little dowel, I should do it up here, a little dowel or a block to allow the bees to have full access to the top and to go through the hardened candy board. But this is one way to do winter feeding. Some people don't have feeders like this. I should mention that this is intended for a 5-frame nuke, not for 8-frame or 10-frame equipment. This is for nukes. What other beekeepers will do is they'll just take a little shim and they'll put a piece of newspaper over the frames of their hive, put that shim, and then fill the cavity above the newspaper with sugar. And that acts as the same function with this feeder that I just demonstrated. Lastly, and if you have other feeders that you use, I'd love to hear about it. There's these frames. So of course, this only works with Langstroth equipment, but this frame you can fill with dry sugar and set it right in with your other frames. Here it is. So the dry sugar is nice and local. The bees, when they're ready for it, they can go into the chamber and pull out some sugar. It also absorbs moisture while it's in the hive. So that's a good method. I personally haven't used these feeder frames for dry feeding. I only use it for feeding syrup. So if you have any experience using dry feed in these feeders, I would really like to hear it. That is a discussion about how beekeepers feed their bees during the winter. What are we going to talk about next? Like I said, where you want the food in the hive is where the bees are. So like if you're going to feed pollen any time of the year, you want to put it right in the brood chamber. That could be between two supers. It could be on top. It's better to have it a little above where the bees are than below. But really, your goal is to get it right where they are. Put it in their noses so they realize it's there. So now I'm going to do a deeper dive into the individual feeds that I mentioned earlier in this Beak Talk. But if you have any questions about anything that I've said so far, definitely drop it in the comments below. I'd love to open up a discussion about that. But let's get going. Dry sugar is my choice feed. It is one of the oldest classic methods of supplemental winter feeding. They call it the sugar camp method or the mountain camp method. There's a few different names for it. But like I said, it's basically adding a space with some newspaper and filling that added space with sugar. Like I said, I don't want to say this is a method that's as old as time. It's really only as old as modern beekeeping since the Langstroth hive, but it's an oldie but goodie. It's a really reliable method for getting your bees through winter. Buying the sugar, I say buy it cheap, buy it in bulk. I bought a fancy name brand as my demonstration prop for today. But in reality, I just use store brand sugar wherever I can find it cheapest. I buy it in 25-pound bags. Sometimes I buy the store out in their 25-pounders, so I have to buy 10-pounders or 4-pounders. Hundreds of pounds of sugar I go through a year in my apiary. And everyone's different, but my nukes, I try and put about 10 pounds of sugar in each nuke. And my adult, like 10-frame Langstroth hives, I'll put anywhere from like 8 to 12 pounds. It depends on the space, but I want to put at least 10 pounds in each hive. And what's great is if the bees don't consume this sugar by the time the spring comes around, you can remove that sugar and actually use it and recycle it to make sugar water. So most beekeepers that I know will do some supplemental feeding in the spring in the form of sugar water or syrup. So this is a great way to recycle that investment that you made in the fall or winter and to help you out in the spring. I have a comment from Pocono Apiaries that I'm going to read here. It says, I've heard mixed things on top entrances during winter. I like to keep the top open with a small hole. Is there a standard or best practice for entrances during winter? This is a great side topic. you might have seen in my feeder here that it has a small upper entrance. Where is it? The upper entrance is a 1/2 inch. It's a 1/2 inch square. And basically what this does is allow some ventilation through the hive. And you're right. Just like any topic in beekeeping, any method, there's people who are gung-ho for it, people who are vehemently against it. It's really up to you and your experiences. It's heavily respondent on your location, not only geographically, but even within like a certain town or county. Some people keep their bees in a really dry patch. Some people keep their bees on a swamp. And those two different locations have to be treated really differently. So it's comments just like that that are the reason why I started this show. I'd like a discussion. So to answer your question, there is not really a standard or best practices for entrances during the winter. Traditionally, you reduce the entrances in the winter and expand them during the summer, but some beekeepers are opposed to that. One tidbit that I'd like to offer, and my approach is I like to try and keep things to what bees naturally want. As far as entrances go, hives that are naturally found in trees, the bees usually look for a single entrance at the bottom of the hive that is about a 2.5 inch to 3 inch diameter circle. So if you're able to replicate that size hole in any form, I would say that's a good thing. But again, it's all about experimenting and it's all about your experiences. So what I recommend is that you try new things and take notes to see what works. Moving forward, I want to talk about fondant. Fondant, I used to feed with fondant. I did for about 5 years. I've stopped doing it probably 4 years ago. There's 2 different kinds of fondants that you should consider. Oh, you're welcome. 2 different fondants that you should consider. One of it is bakery fondant, which is the stuff that you would have on cakes, like I talked about earlier. It's thicker, so it's really like a Play-Doh-y kind of consistency. That stuff is great. I found that feeding fondant in tandem with other moisture reducing practices for winter can actually dry the fondant out too much for the bees to be able to consume. So that's one thing to consider. Bakery fondant, you can purchase, you can go to a bakery and just ask them for a couple pounds. If you're a person who only has 1 or 2 hives in your apiary, you might only need, 15, 20 pounds of fondant. And a bakery can usually give you a good price if you're buying it in bulk like that. The other thing that you can purchase, it's called 90-10 fondant. It's used to make icings and glazes and things like that, also within a bakery. So you can go, again, to a bakery and purchase that, or you can go to a beekeeping distributor or a food distributor. The 90-10 fondant is actually really liquidy. It's really loose. So you have to use a tool to like scrape it out of its container. And I've noticed that it gets really drippy. So it can go between the frames and kind of get gunky. Like I said, if it's used with other moisture reducing practices, it will it'll dry up and become kind of, it might make it hard for the bees to navigate the hive. If you're using 90-10 fondant without moisture reducing practices, you might actually make a soup in the hive, which can make the bees really uncomfortable. But if you have other experience with feeding fondant, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Candy boards. Candy boards are a fun discussion. I personally haven't used candy boards. Candy boards are kind of the same as sugar cubes, where it's just like sugar that's stuck together, clumped together. A lot of beekeepers purchase candy boards or candy blocks that are already made up. The candy blocks usually come in 4 or 5 pound bricks, and you just put them right in the hive, and it offers a little bit of supplemental feed. The recipe that I found, and I heard that a few other people use for making their own candy boards, is 8 pounds of sugar, just like this. So this is 4 pounds. So I'd grab 2 of these bags, 1.5 cups of water. If you have well water, I would try and use distilled water or like bottled water, simply to mitigate any bacteria that might be in your water. Keep in mind that you're going to make these candy boards, and they very well could sit in the hive for 4 or 5 months, depending on your location. So you might want to include some mold or bacteria reducing products. Some recipes call for a tablespoon of white vinegar, and that acts as an anti-fermentation, antibacterial mold kind of inhibitor. You also can just do sugar and water as your candy board recipe. Some people will add a feed stimulant, something like Pro Health, Pro Sweet, Honeybee Healthy, Hive Alive. Those are some of the names of the big brands of feed stimulants. I would only add a little bit. So for this 8 pound recipe that I just told you, I would do either a teaspoon of white vinegar or a teaspoon of feed stimulant. A lot of feed stimulants already have mold inhibitors in them, so that's kind of a double whammy. Some people will also add pollen to their candy board. I would have you refer back to when I was talking about winter feeding of pollen. If you are inexperienced with it, I would say sit out the feeding of pollen during the winter. So that is candy boards. If you have a different recipe for your candy boards, or if you have some experience with it, I would please ask you to leave it in the comments so we can have this discussion, and some other beekeepers who are trying to learn can get a different perspective. And the last thing I want to talk about is feeding honey. All these other methods of feeding, all these other feeds that I discussed are more on the commercial or traditional, or maybe some of them more organic methods of beekeeping. Feeding honey is the only true natural, hardcore, natural, organic way of supplemental feeding your bees. And basically what this consists of is, during the summer, during your peak honey flow, harvesting full capped frames of honey. And you don't harvest them for yourself. You don't spin them. You don't cut comb them. You just keep them in the bee shed until winter. And what you'll do is, in the fall, your last inspection, you'll go into the hive and pull out any foundation. If you have foundation that's not drawn, get rid of it. If you have drawn comb that doesn't have anything in it, get rid of it. Keep the brood in the middle of the box, and then fill the outside frames with those frames of capped honey. And basically what this is instead of adding food on top of the frames, you're just literally adding more honey to the hive to make sure that they're aced out wall-to-wall food. A lot of beekeepers don't like doing this because Surplus honey is what we like to extract, to give away as gifts, feed our family, or to maybe make some income. So that's some of the give and take. But I will say that feeding bees honey is by far the most nutritious food you can give your bees. It is by far the least controversial feeding method, the least invasive, the least problematic to the bees. It is, if you are in a position where you can feed your bees full capped frames of honey, go for it. Go for it every time. One thing that I do, of course, I'll feed my bees during the winter. I'll feed them with sugar on top, but I'll go in that first warm day in March here in Pennsylvania. Early March is when it's still a little too cold to be doing like manipulations on the hives. But you might have a warm day where you can do a quick inspection and just see how things are doing. What I'll do is I'll go in and I'll determine who's dead. It's just a way of beekeeping. If you have 5 hives, chances are you'll lose 2 of them. That is beekeeping and what we have to deal with. What I'll do is I'll go into those dead hives. I'll determine the reason they died. If they died because they might have been queenless, or if they couldn't get to the food that I left them, or even if they had like too many mites or something, I can reuse that equipment. I can reuse that food, all those frames. I don't have to do anything to it. I should just scrape off anything that looks really gunky. If there's like a chunk of mold or a lot of dead bees, I can scrape those out. Otherwise, those frames are completely reusable. So I'll remove all the dead hives, and I'll pick out the frames that still have food in them. And then on the warm days, I'll go in very quickly. I shouldn't say quickly like you're acting quickly, but try and do your inspections without disturbing the bees a whole lot. What I'll do is I'll go in and pull out any frames that are like drawn comb, but that don't actually have any resources on them. No brood, no pollen, no honey. And I'll replace those drawn frames with those frames of honey, because during the early spring, the bees really appreciate any food that you can give them. And like I said, feeding honey is the absolute best thing that you can do for your bees. And it's nice having those drawn combs. If you clean out your dead outs a little before you're expecting to do splits, here in the Poconos, we try and do splits in the first week of April, which is when dandelions start to bloom. That's when you want all your drawn comb clean and ready to go, so you can make your splits and give them space to expand. But that is my discussion on talking about winter feeding. If you have any comments or any experience with feeding your bees during the winter, or reasons why you don't feed your bees during the winter, I'd love to have those in the comments, and I can get back to you after this live stream and just talk about those ideas. This is the whole point of this show, is to create an inviting environment for new beekeepers to learn from more experienced beekeepers, and to just discuss all of the different ways that people run their operations. There's a joke in the beekeeping community that if you ask 10 different beekeepers the same question, you'll get 25 different answers, because even a single beekeeper can't decide on one method. So that's what I'm trying to open up with this show called BeekTalk. It airs on Might Fight's Facebook page and YouTube channel, so you can watch me and subscribe on either of those two locations. The show airs Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. It's a half hour or about a half hour show. And next week, we're going to be talking about winter projects. Here in the Poconos, I am pretty much done with my bees until March or April. And I kind of personally get bummed out when I can't, look at my bees and do bee stuff. So I try and fill my winters with projects that make it easier to keep bees in the summer. So next week, Tuesday at 4 o'clock on Might Fight's Facebook and YouTube channel, we'll be talking about winter projects. But for now, that is the Beek Talk, and I'll talk to you next week. Thank you.